thank you for joining us. I'm Cécile Gregoriades, Director of Marketing and Communication here at Ecole Bilingue. Our topic today is talking with children about racial injustice. During this webinar, we're going to learn about how to engage children in conversations about race, social injustice, and anti-racist practices. We're also going to define common terms like racism, white privilege, diversity, inclusion, and others. We will also answer some questions that parents may have, such as, when is a child old enough to talk about race, to have a conversation about race? Or how do parents even reach the subject with their kids? We're lucky to have 5 wonderful presenters today with us who are going to guide us through these conversations and questions. And I'm going to introduce them briefly. We'll start with Christopher. Christopher Colebourn has been teaching SEL, social and emotional learning, for the past 5 years at Ecole Bilingue. He's received his training in SEL from Mindful Schools and in conflict resolution and restorative justice practices from SEEDS Community Resolution Center. His role is to help children better regulate their emotions, learn how to read emotions in others, build positive self-esteem, learn how to calm the mind and the body, and show empathy and compassion for others. We also have with us Douglas Gostlin. Douglas has a dual license as a marriage, family, and child therapist, and a licensed professional clinical counselor. He is currently a school counselor at Ecole Bilingue and works primarily with older elementary children and middle school students. Will Hammond is also with us. Will is the Parents Association Diversity Chair at EB, and he's been in this role for the last 2 years. He's also the father of 2 mixed-race children who are at EB and are in 2nd and 4th grade. Our third presenter is Gabrielle Hedlund. Gabrielle is a middle school English and social studies teacher at Ecole Bilingue, and she's also the advisory coordinator at the middle school. Our fourth presenter on this panel is Carla Maya. Carla is EB's diversity leader and lower school counselor. She has 17 years of experience working as a lower school counselor and social and emotional learning specialist at international schools in the US, Portugal, and Brazil. So now that you know a little bit more about our presenters, let's dive into our webinar. Just so you know, we are here together until 10 o'clock this morning, and participants are more than welcome to ask questions. You can chime in through the chat during the presentation, and we'll get to your question at the end. You can also just unmute yourself at the end and ask your question directly if you're comfortable with that. So you know, the webinar is recorded, and we'll share it with everybody after, sometimes tomorrow. All right, let's go ahead. Christopher, you can get started.
Okay, welcome everybody. We're so glad you're here. We hope that we can impart some advice for you concerning talking to your kids about race and how to move forward with this. It's a pretty complex issue, and you know, we're trying the best we can, and by no way, I can only speak about myself personally. I'm a work in progress, and I'm learning as we go, and it's pretty humbling. And anyway, I thought that we could start with a moment of silence for Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. And also, it's not only a moment of silence, but a moment of reflection to think about and be cognizant of how painful it is right now, a painful time for the Black community and our Black friends, and just to be aware and sensitive to that. So let's have a moment of silence for a moment here. We'll do 1 minute. Okay, and as the it's tradition of our SEL classes that we teach. We always start with 3 deep breaths. We found that it's a great way to sort of get the blood pumping and find a good relaxing place to be. So let's do 3 deep breaths together. All right.
So, once again, thank you all for being here today, and just want to remind us what our purpose is today with this webinar is to kind of be able to learn how to engage our children in conversations about race, about social injustice, and anti-racist practices. And some things that we want to be able to keep in mind during this presentation is that, these are tough conversations. And, they might lead to some discomfort. And it's, we want you to lean into that discomfort. We want to lean into our own discomfort. We also want to be self-responsible and self-challenging, right? Move ourselves out of our bubbles. And, just as Christopher led us through, be able to, when those emotions are heightened, take a deep breath and then give yourself some time to process your feelings and question why you're having those feelings and be able to go through them.
So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit now about just as we get started and with this conversation and this topic. There's really 3 areas that we want to look at. We want to, first of all, kind of understand where we are. To, take care of yourself, understand what you're feeling. Kind of like taking our emotional temperature. They're taking for, like in terms of the pandemic, people are having their temperature taken to make sure if they have symptoms of COVID. Well, same with your emotional. Kind of take that at temperature, kind of gauge where you are. Then we have to take care of each other. Like it would start with taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, and then how to take care of our community and take care of our space. And when from previous talks, when you talk about resilience, there's resilience as the individual, there's the resilience that you have with your family, and then if you look at like our community of EB, we're resilience as a community. So those are, as we go into the feelings, think about those 3 areas. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I'd like to just start off. There was as you know, that Michelle Obama and Barack Obama have been giving, graduation speeches over the last couple of weeks. And I love this quote by Michelle Obama last week when she was speaking to some high schoolers. And I'm just going to go ahead and read it. So much has changed so quickly. And if any of you are confused or scared or angry or just plain overwhelmed, I want you to know that you aren't alone. I am feeling all of that too. And I have a few things I want to say about it. And then you can, when we share this presentation, you can actually get a link to that particular talk. It's fantastic to listen to. And that goes into the next area is, we all have had a range of reactions to what has happened recently. You take the pandemic and then all the racial injustice that has been exposed with the killing of George Floyd. And inside and outside of EB, I've talked with a lot of people, I've done a lot of reading, and these are some of the feelings that have come up. Ones on the left here, some people are just numb. We just don't know. It's almost like you become overwhelmed with feeling that you just don't even know what to feel. It's kind of a way of protecting yourself. Or confused, overwhelmed, shocked, sad, down, anxious, worried. And so we have different ranges within these categories. The ones that I see more new coming up as a result, if you take this first top part of the list down to hopeless, that was around the pandemic. Then with this stuff happening with George Floyd, you're seeing a lot more outrage, angry, people being resentful, and also exhausted by, this other level of events. So that's just kind of gauge where, first, like in helping and talking with your child, understand where you are. And I look at 2 things with the feelings is the intensity. And one good way to just measure the intensity is say, out of a scale of 1 to 10, how intense am I feeling these feelings? I mean, being angry at a 5 out of 10 is a normal reaction to what's going on. If you start getting up into 10 out of 10 and you're getting maybe getting a little bit too explosive or too losing patience too much, then you might want to tone that back. Work with somebody or find ways like even Carla's saying, take deep breaths, exercise. Another part with the feelings is over the duration of time. Are they something that just stay is it an up and down feeling, or are those feelings continuous? And that's again where you might want to seek some help if you need to. The other, though, on the flip side of that is, especially when you talk about feelings of anger and outrage, those are energizing feelings, and they're energizing for a reason. Those are so on the positive side, those are pushing us to take action. They're empowering, they're energizing. And when I talk with students, they say, I want to do something. And so they're energized to go out if their parents could let them and they could do it safely, protesting or making signs to put in their yard or put on their cars to unify us as a community. So those are just some general feelings. And again, I want to say is, and I got this from another presentation, is before we deal with our kids, we kind of want to, like what the airlines say, put on your oxygen mask first, then put on your child's. And same with this, when dealing with the feelings, deal with yours first, then help your child. And then this is just to, again, take what's happening now and put it into context of where we are as a world right now, because it is different. I mean, the kids, we're exposed to much more media right now. We have access to so many different sources. And just like even talking with students, I mean, there are some that have watched the George Floyd, the actual killing of him, and you really want to limit that. I mean, it's already one time is enough, and some people are watching over and over again, so you really want to limit that exposure. The stuff with the all these atrocities is causing more fear and causing more people to feel helpless, like we can't do as much. Again, as a caregiver, you want to be able to you can instill resilience in your child. You can teach them resilience. So you want to be there to support your child and be caring with them. And then again, it's okay to be tired. We're all just tired between being behind the Zoom so much, or trying to juggle so many different things between teaching our kids and also taking care of trying to do our jobs as well.
So over the next couple of slides, we've compiled a couple of different definitions of some keywords that might show up in your conversations about race, racism, and social injustice. We're not going to go through all of them, so we're just going to go highlight through some of the ones that might come up mostly in this presentation. So racism is a really hard thing to kind of define, or define just one definition of what that means. And it's a very complex definition. So we just found a couple of things. So one could be any attitude, action, or inaction which subordinates a person or group because of their race, color, ethnicity. Racism in the US and most of the world is a system of hierarchy and inequality based on race. It operates historically, institutionally, and culturally to produce preferential treatment, privilege, and power for white people at the expense of people of color. We also want to reference implicit bias. So the definition that we found was this refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. The next two ones that we want to talk about really briefly are about privilege, and specifically white privilege, right? So basically privilege is our inherent advantages that someone can possess, and that could be defined by different things, by ability, by class, by gender, by their education, by race, by their socioeconomic status. But when we're discussing specifically about white privilege, we're talking about something that's an innate advantage that is just solely based on one's whiteness, right? And it's very separate from their effort, their income, their gender, anything else. So that's basically having greater access to power and resources than people of color do in the same situation. And the last two terms that we just want to highlight is racial injustice. So racial injustice is the proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all. And then last, what is an anti-racist? So Kendi tells us that an anti-racist is someone who expresses an anti-racist idea or supports an anti-racist policy with their actions. It's an idea that says racial groups are equal, right? And as applied to white people, an anti-racist is a person who makes a conscious choice to act and challenge some aspect of the white supremacy system, including their own white privilege, as well as any form of oppression against people of color. So, as we talked about at the beginning, right, we know that these can be very difficult conversations. And sometimes because of their complexity, we often are afraid to engage in them, right? As Brene Brown tells us, people are opting out of vital conversations about diversity and inclusivity because they fear looking wrong, saying wrong, or being wrong. Choosing our own comfort over hard conversations is the epitome of privilege, and it corrodes trust and moves us away from meaningful and lasting change. Whether it's conversations with ourselves, conversations with our family, with our social groups, within our own institutions. We often avoid these because we don't know what to say sometimes. We avoid conflict. We choose our own comfort over leaning in the comfort of everyone. So that's our greatest purpose today, is to challenge ourselves and you to be able to engage in those conversations and to move that conversation forward. Cecilia, can you move forward, please? So one of the big questions is my child too young to have this conversation, right? We always worry about, keeping their innocence, are we changing the way that they view the world when we engage them in these conversations? Cecile, can you move over to the next one, please? And the answer is no, they are not too young, right? So as early as 3 months, babies are able to already be able to distinguish differences, physical differences, right? When it comes to skin color, right? They're able to recognize ones that match the race of their caregivers, right? Starting as early as 2 and 3-year-old, children already are able to distinguish and use race as reasons for people's behavior based on what they are hearing from the adults and what they observe from the environment around them, right? So when we think about that already at age 5, that children are able to already express racial prejudice based on the environment that they are exposed to, right? From the behaviors of the adults around them. And then, so by 5 and 7, right, some of the research shows that explicit conversations about interracial friendship can dramatically improve their racial attitudes in as little as a week. And if we think about children very young, we have conversations with them about fairness, right? We use the word fair. Children are able to understand that concept very early on. So if we can have that conversation about fairness, we know that we can be able to have that conversation about race. All right, so I'm going to pass on the word to Will and Gabrielle a little bit about, from a parent perspective, about how we start to have these conversations with our kids.
Like as a parent, as a white parent, and my spouse is also white, we have we have different conversations, I think, than Will and his wife do, and his partner do, about how we talk to kids, because I need our kids to be aware of their privilege and aware of who they are, how they present, how people see them, how they interact, and the things that they see in a way that is different than a family that is African American, a family that is biracial, a family that is another visible group. But coming from a place of care, being honest and clear, making comparisons regarding inequality and exclusion and inequity. We do a lot of checking in when we hear things on the news. So, my kids are in the car with me in the morning on the way to school. If something comes up in the news, I stop and we talk about what they're hearing. I ask them what they think. So we're asking open-ended questions. I try to give open-ended questions as opposed to leading questions. So what do you think about that? As opposed to, that seemed wrong, didn't it? Asking them to try to make comparisons to the things that they see at school so that they can start taking these larger issues and making them more personal so that they are understanding if they see an inequity, if they see something unfair, that they can identify that as such, that we are constantly trying to check our own bias, making sure conversations don't end in confusion or fear. I do not say to my children ever, everything will be okay. That will never happen. You will be safe at all, because those are, what I do say is we are prepared. We do these things to try to prepare them as much as possible. We talk about standing up for other people. There are bystanders and there are upstanders, and it's not new language, but if you haven't heard it, the bystanders are people who observe. And in many circles, the bystander is as guilty or as responsible, I should say, if not more, than the person perpetrating in the first place. Because the idea of the bystander is actually, better, but you've made a conscious decision to stand by and not do anything. And we really want our children to be upstanders. We want them to feel that they can speak up for themselves and that they can speak up for others, whether that is speaking up to somebody at school, so telling someone you can't do this thing, or raising the issue then to a teacher, a parent, an administrator, having the courage to do so. And then the role for us is to listen to the child who is saying this thing happened and it bothered me, and really letting them tell their story without judgment, without punishment, but really like listening to them. And then trying to get them involved in community activities. And especially I think if you are a white family, that it's really easy to be in a place of comfort with everybody who sort of looks like you. And you can get a little lazy, I think, about branching out. And this is not unlike companies making active, specific decisions to change their workforce and to change their workplace environment. We have to say, I am going to diversify my world. That's through activities, changing your friends or adding new friends, actively seeking people, not waiting for something to sort of fall in your lap. Looking at things. Now there's like artwork downtown, going into places that maybe you feel discomfort, but then kind of thinking, if you're coming into a space, why are you feeling that discomfort? But going anyway, and then also taking it away from yourself. Like maybe somebody's uncomfortable that you're in their community space, and kind of trying to look at it in those ways. Diverse and inclusive home library. At the end of the slides, there are some book list suggestions, and the librarians and some of the teachers can recommend additional books for your family library, for yourself or your children. Engaging and empowering your children, giving them agency to make signs, to write letters, to do things that are the things that you want them to do. And by the way, acknowledging that they're probably going to be ahead of you. They may be moving past your comfort level into a space that is feels maybe more radical than where you are. And honestly, that's kind of what we want, right? We want them to be better than we are. So we are moving forward and moving forward and moving forward, so that our kids, by the time they're 20, are where we are at 40 or 50. Or maybe now they're where we are at 40 or 50. And always letting them know that it's okay to ask questions. And if you don't have an answer, please don't pretend like you do. I don't know. Let's look into this together. Where should we go to find an answer? What can we do to answer that question? And make it something that the two of you do together. A lot of the conversations with our kids have been, and then I'm going to pass it to Will, but a lot of conversation with my children have been around safety, safety for themselves, but also really a lot of concern about safety for other people. So when we did the Children's March on Sunday, my 9-year-old was really concerned because he knew that the police have taken some violent actions against people at protests. And he was really worried that the police would come down. And I walked through things with him, like why was he worried about it and what things had he seen. We talked about the changes in the OPD and how they've been interacting with protesters over the course of these last few days. We talked about his safety and being white, and that maybe we feel worried in a different way, but it's a worry that we know that many of our friends feel every day, concerns that they have every day. And so to be empathetic with him, I didn't tell him everything was going to be okay because I couldn't actually say that. I said that we would be as safe as we could be. And I think that some people are uncomfortable with that, but like, I just don't think that it's okay to tell my children that everything will be okay when I don't actually know. It feels like a lie that I can't hold on to for them, but that's my decision with my parenting. And other questions may come up, but we'll have time to also speak. So I'm going to pass to Will.
Hi.
Hi.
We are in the new normal. So I really appreciate this conversation and this webinar, and I want to thank Douglas and Carla and Christopher and Gabrielle for just having this forum for us to be able to conversate about what's happening right now. And I think I've expressed a little bit about my background yesterday in a very emotional, kind of precursor to this. But I actually grew up in the private school system. I came from public school in 5th grade, and then my mom put me into Grace Cathedral School for Boys back in 1980, 81. And so I was a kid of the 80s growing up in a very institutional space where none of this was ever talked about. There was no conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion. There was no conversations about safe spaces, anything like that. And so this was all new territory for both me and for a lot of kids of color. And so it was a very kind of difficult time for me. And I think the one takeaway was, as a kid of the 80s, none of those systems were in place in any of those institutions. And so the fact that when I was being teased or bullied in terms of race, teachers and staff and administration weren't able to say, hey, that's wrong based on these, kind of parameters. And I think that's what's great about Ecole Bilingue, is that we already have systems in place for zero tolerance for any of that stuff. So growing up, I definitely saw a lot more sort of this growth of institutions learning how to deal with implicit bias and bullying toward, in terms of integrated racism. And so coming to a school like EB with, as a parent, there was a little bit of kind of PTSD, but understanding that there was still like these safety nets that were supporting my kids. And again, I've told stories about, my growing up, but it doesn't compare to, again, what's happening right now. And I think as a young adult, I started seeing stuff happening in sort of these spaces where kids of color were being treated as adults, which is completely crazy to me. 10 years ago, we celebrated, or 10 years ago today, we are celebrating the death of Oscar Grant, who was killed at the BART station. And I remember being an adult thinking, well, he shouldn't have done that, or he shouldn't have been acting this way. But realizing that, why was that happening? And why were cops not de-escalating situations, but escalating the situation? And here we are today, 10 years later, still asking that question. So what we have to do as adults is to ask ourselves, how do we communicate that to our kids? I know that Black parents are talking to their kids about how to stay safe and how to communicate with police and authority. But the real question is, how do we communicate with each other in terms of knowing that these systems are in place? You know, we have the Constitution, we have, statutes that say we're all a part of the human race, we're all created equal. But how do we uphold those statutes and say, we will not improvise, we will not make up things as we go along. We will hold steadfast to the things that are already set in place. And so I try to institute that information to my kids as much as I can about just honoring the information that's already there. And I think that's the biggest issue, is not to improvise, not to reinvent the wheel, but to look at what's already in place and to hold, again, if the fact that we had a zero tolerance policy for bullying at EB, and then we decided, well, we're going to push that aside and we're going to do what we want to do in the classroom or in the, in the situation that we're in, that would make no sense at all. So I look at this situation right now as, what do we need to do to improve on making sure that we uphold our human rights, parameters?
So the middle school students, I teach 8th grade English and 8th grade social studies and 7th grade social studies. And I saw the 8th graders really a lot last week, and came in on Monday and had them for 2 different classes and started in on conversations. The first round was a check-in, and we include this so we can think about what is happening in the classrooms, and how we try to find space and change change maybe how our teaching practices and so forth. I will say that for parents who, I'm by no means perfect about this, but for parents who have kids at the middle school, I really tried this year in taking over social studies to take the material that Jennifer Hammond used and build on it, and added some additional things in around, for example, the indigenous peoples of the Americas prior to colonialism, and additional work around Reconstruction this year with some new materials from the New York Times and some other places, to continue sort of expanding and changing how we look at history. For example, we've changed some of the readings and the texts that we're using. I buy a lot of books for our classroom library. Some of them are recommended at the end of the thing, but like looking for ways to change sort of what kids are seeing and doing in the school. I did give them a chance to write about how they were feeling and write about how they were seeing the news, and to share some of their feelings about it. I showed them Trevor Noah's 18-minute long piece. I think he's like he's sitting in his bedroom and he's talking about George Floyd, and he talks about looting and so forth. And then we had a conversation about things that he said. The question about looting came up, as I'm sure that it does in a lot of households. And I didn't, like the thing with being open-ended is I can't give the answer for whether it's right or wrong. What other students said was that they gave their perspectives about looting. And they said, It feels like people are more concerned with the buildings than with Black bodies.
Mhm.
You're more concerned with the finances and something that can be rebuilt rather than with a physical person. So they managed the conversation. The tools that I used for that to help them with it is we did a lot of things that are, and again, this is something we can share with you, but sentence starters. So I hear what you're saying. Could I paraphrase or repeat back to you what I think you're saying? So that they were listening and making sure they were really hearing each other or being heard, and trying to diffuse some of those. I also showed the 8th graders a movie called Whose Streets, which is a documentary about the Ferguson protests, and it's all from the activists' perspective, many of whom are young, and it's talking about the beginning, you know, the early BLM, and about the way that it was covered, so that they could start thinking about how we see and how protests and riots and looting gets framed in the media, and about personal experience again with that. I tried to give them a lot of space to then think about it and reflect on it. I used some of the materials again with 7th grade, and I'll say that not everybody liked it. I know that students were texting each other in the background. Somebody said, I don't know why she's doing this. Like, why is she talking about this with us? And the student who brought that to my attention said, I don't know how to answer this without sounding angry, right? And, you know, this whole thing with especially Black students having to worry about being seen, or Black girls, loud and angry and immediately prejudiced. You know, we start to shut down when we, the greater population, teachers, parents, people in public, white people. Why are they so loud? Why do they do those things? And these kids are monitoring their reactions. And I said, one thing I think what we're hearing is defensiveness. So if you're, you know, when you're white and you hear these comments, or you hear people say, what about this? You might feel guilty. You might think, well, I'm doing enough. You might think, I've got Black friends, I'm reading the right books, I'm doing the right things, I've gone to the movies, I'm going to the seminars. So why are you talking to me? And probably everyone on this call has had that feeling at some point or another, like, that's not me. And I would say, and this is what I said to my students, is you have to take yourself out of this and not make it about you personally, although it is. But the comment is not a personal attack. The comment is, how are we looking at this in this narrative? And instead of making it about you and putting yourself at the center of the conversation, to be listening and listening to what that person is saying about how they're feeling, how they're reacting to something, and these larger issues. And then going back and saying, okay, I hear that. I feel really threatened by it. I thought I was doing the right thing. You know, I thought that I was standing up, but maybe I haven't been. Or I thought that I was open-minded, and maybe I'm not as open-minded as I thought I should be, and I need to take a step back, right? So it's a constant, and I ask students, and I ask my children, and I ask myself to have this kind of constant conversation in my head. Why are you reacting this way? Move yourself out of the center of the conversation. Your video. And the other thing is, it really, in terms of like news and so forth, is a lot of it is asking what photos are used when we're talking about people in the news. What are the images that are used to represent people? Michael Brown's images, frankly, made him look like a criminal. And then all of a sudden, what was surfacing were pictures of him in his school graduation outfit. Those are different images. When you talk to your kids, or I talk to students, it's about who's telling the story, who's the witness, what are they saying? And then the same thing at school. When you come back to school issues, like, who is in this conversation, who's not in the conversation? Why are we attracted to this person? Why are we not attracted to that person? And really trying to kind of like build a framework for yourselves and your kids around, honestly, it's critical questioning kind of all the time. So.
Christopher, maybe you could just give a quick highlight about the work that you've been doing over the last couple of weeks with the younger students, so that we can have a little bit of a connection.
Absolutely, I'd be glad to do that. So yeah, I've been working with first through fifth grade, and last week was entirely dedicated to what's occurring out in the world, internationally, and what's happening here. And so I shared with them an amazing video book that's called Something Happened in Our Town. And it's the perspective of two families, a black family and a white family, in basically police shootings of innocent black men. And it's more detailed than that, and it frames it in a way that they reference bullying at school, so the information is a little more accessible for the children in the story. So it's basically parents talking to their kids about what's happening in real time regarding police shootings. I would suggest sharing it with your kids. It's amazing. It's at the end of our it's in our resource section. But we've been talking a lot of open-ended questions. I'm going to be checking in with them this week to come back to it because it is an ongoing conversation. It's pretty profound. It's pretty deep. The kids are able to talk about it, I think, and it's good to talk to them and say, what are you seeing? How do you see this first? Because I've found that many of the kids don't really know what's going on, and they have their own interpretations of it, which can be kind of dangerous. So that's why it's important for us to be really clear about, what's really happening and what's going on. So that's that.
Okay, I know we have a couple more slides we wanted to show parents, but I think we only have 8 minutes until the end of our webinar, and I really want to hear from people who are in the audience. We have had questions pre-submitted. We also have a few questions in the chat. So, I don't know if some of you, Carla, Douglas, Christopher, Will, have been looking at the questions, and you can just go ahead and tackle them if you see one that you can answer.
I think Melissa had posted a question about being a bystander. And I think we have this discussion often with our kids when it refers to bullying and what that looks like when we're talking about bullying at school. And I think, that's a good way to start off that conversation. Again, we talked about fairness. That's a concept that children understand very early on. So, being able to have those open conversations with, open-ended questions like, well, what do you think, that person who saw something should have done, right? What do you think your friends could do, or what you could do? So opening up that question to them and starting from where they are. So using that age-appropriate language that they are, seeing where they're coming from, and then building off that. I think, as Gabrielle said at one point, sometimes our kids are even way ahead of where we are or where we even think they are. So I think opening up the questions to them, even within the community. We often, I remember, we went to a protest this past Saturday in my community, and I had to prepare my child. I said, we're going to see some people who are going to be very supportive. We're going to see some people who might be silent, and we might see some people who are going to be not so nice, and teaching them how to engage with that, or and be able to stand up and having questions. And luckily, I think most people were very supportive, but we did come across some people who were not so kind, and that led to lots of conversations about, why were they acting that way? What was their feelings that led them to act that way? So using those experiences and using those questions, or even referring to situations that they might observe at school, and going from that. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on that.
I think another point is to contrast that with history, right? So the first real protest or march that my kids were privy to was the Women's March back in 2017. And so we connected that to women's suffrage, which connected to you know, the right to vote, which connected to, you know, abortion rights. And so I think, like you said, kids are resilient and kids have a way of connecting the dots if you can teach them how to map it, you know. And I think as educators, we're doing the same thing, and we're doing it every single day. So I think the goal right now, and this is really a pivotal time, everyone is at home, everyone is hyper focused on what's happening. And so this is a really good time for us now to start building curriculum, building understanding of how history, 1619 Middle Passage, connects to police brutality. And it's a really easy way to frame it if we do it without all the doom and gloom and, you know, blood and guts and gore. You don't need to put all that other stuff in there because that's just hype, you know. But if you put in the reference of 1619 was a really interesting time because it was da 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 da, you know, and then build it towards, we have these things set up in place, but some people aren't adhering to the rules of freedom and, you know, equal justice. So
thank you, Will. We have a comment in the chat, and I'll let Jeremy. I know Jeremy is raising his hand. I'm just going to relay a question from I believe it's Audrey, and I'm going to try to paraphrase her question or comment, which is, we are in a school with a lot of European and French parents, and for those parents, discovering or learning what is racism in the US is different from where they come from in France. There is very different approach to how we talk about racism. Maybe we don't talk about it or talk about it the same way. There are a lot of diversity in France, a lot of history with people from Africa and North Africa, and maybe what French people associate with racism with their country is more a racism towards Muslim, so it's more associated with religion and maybe to an extent skin color, but I think that's how primarily French people see it, is prejudice towards Muslims. And so that's just a comment that that this person was having, and I was just trying to reflect on it. This different approach, and knowing that it's complex because we are in a community with people who are for sure Americans and understand the history of the US, but also, people from France with a different approach, and with this whole environment of color blindness, which is where we come from in France, is to sort of trying to not see race and trying to see us as equal, no matter going beyond the skin color. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that.
Well, it's something I think going to Will's question about, or discussion about the curriculum and about material is, as we look at how we change, as we look at what we teach, part of what we teach has to be looking more candidly and differently at US history, but also France's colonialist history. And it's a question that we were all discussing before this, but, and we know that in Histoire Géo, it has to be part of the conversation, because we know that it's easy, I think, as an American. I know that often the thing is like, oh, you Americans, you talk about race all the time and blah, blah. Well, we are not talking about it enough, and we haven't really addressed our own history, but we're kind of thick in the muck of it. France needs to come along, and Ecole Bilingue could really be amazing as a leader, leading that change, right, in our own curriculum, in our own yard, and how we talk about things like that.
And the same applies to other Europeans and with
yes.
colonial histories. Being able to discuss that, and because often, I can speak for myself, coming from a Portuguese background, and having lived in both Portugal and Brazil, I heard both sides of history. And that was very eye-opening for not only for myself, but for my child to be able to experience that. And I remember having the conversation even when he was in Portuguese class in Brazil and hearing part of the history. And he was like, for the first time at the age of 5, he goes, "Are Portuguese bad people?" And having to have that conversation, right? Because he had never heard that side of history. And it never had occurred to us to even expose him to that side of history, right? And we had become blind because often we are seen as the great conquerors, and and that's been beautified and glorified in our history. So being able to even confront that with our cultural backgrounds, that often, European backgrounds, is really important, and to be able to expose that and to be able to move forward from that. Because if we don't, then we can't, we're only just at the surface and not really diving deeper in.
Christopher had to leave because he actually has to go teach a class.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to pull up one of the questions that was submitted before. I know that Jeremy has his hand up, and Laura, you just raised your hand. But one of the questions was, what is the best, it's, does my white child learning about racism place a burden on non-white children, and how can I be supportive as a parent? Which I think is a good question actually for all of us. And if somebody else would like to answer it, you from those of us that are here, like Will or Carla, we can. But I think that the answer is that it's not incumbent on somebody who is not white to educate your child. And your child learning, unless what we would discourage you from doing is pivoting to your classmate, your Black classmate or your Black friend, and saying, and what about you? And making that person uncomfortable at the center, somehow responsible for the narrative for all people. But educating yourself and educating your child, and also being aware that that's not somebody else's job to do. That's not other child's job to do. And if anybody wants to add to that, please.
I want to let Jeremy ask his question. Just he's been raising his hand for a while, and we're over the webinar. So Laura has a question after Jeremy. Jeremy, go ahead.
Okay, I'll make it quick. So I want to piggyback on, I think Will and something Gabrielle just said. We're in a context right now. We're in COVID. We have this really long summer to look forward to, with a lot more time with our kids than I think any of us were expecting. And of course, there's a lot of stress on the economic front. But then you would throw into the mix this important critical conversation that we're having right now about race. Is there a school? Is the school decided to create a sort of like a centralized place? I know that I talked with Will and a few other people about this, both at school and outside of school. But is there a way that we can, bring all of these tools and resources together, and maybe also have a forum in one place? And if I'm already saying something that people have already done, then I'll just stop. But that's what I would love to see for the summer is, that I'll be honest with you, I didn't even know about this meeting because I didn't even get a chance to go through all my emails until Maria pinged me. So I'm kind of overwhelmed in my inbox. I would love to have, maybe a point person from the school or a couple point people just throughout the summer to help the rest of us, stay current and stay on top of this. Thank you.
That's a great suggestion, Jeremy. I think that's a really good one that we can talk about how to make that happen. And it could be as easy as a Google list or some sort of group that wants to inform it. We have talked about having things like we have sort of talked about different ways of addressing the issues of affinity groups and of reading groups that, of community reading and almost like a book club to, because I think sometimes too, reading books in isolation, like if you read White Fragility, if you read How to Be Anti-Racist, I think sometimes you can be overwhelmed and you want to talk to somebody else about it, and maybe having a space for those conversations to happen that is facilitated either by the school or by the parent community or by some combination, I think is something that we can make note of.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
That we have noted. Sorry, that we did talk about.
And we are in the process, of compiling all those resources, whether it's books for, obviously right now, for faculty and staff. And that, that is something that can be then shared with the whole community, and be able to, that way be just a one kind of place where centralized, where you can be able to research, whether it's articles or books or other things that you can be able to use, whether just for yourself as adults or to be able to use with your kids directly too.
All right, we'll take one more question from Laura and then we'll wrap it up. Laura, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me a minute. you know, just to sort of echo what Will said, I think it's really helpful to frame everything in a historical lens. And, you know, Dr. Kendi, in addition to writing How to Be an Anti-Racist, also wrote Stand from the Beginning, which is also now available in a condensed or sort of a middle school book, which is wonderful. And it gives a very interesting lens, because racist ideas are actually originally European. In order to commoditize and sell and trade Black bodies, Black people had to be dehumanized, right? And so this is just a wonderful historical research-based book about that, and how they are truly European ideas. And then, you know, I'm going to be taking over Will's role as DEI chair this coming year. And I'd like everyone to, you know, the young people who are protesting are talking about a lot about reimagining. And I would love everyone to reimagine what it's going to be like to walk through the EB gates this coming school year, and how are you going to take a role in making sure that our community and our culture are inclusive. Because I'm not going to be able to do this work alone. We're going to need everyone, and we can't just rely on the Black and brown people in our community. We need everyone's support, every parent, everyone. And so thank you. And I look forward to working with everyone on this.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Laura.
That's
Cecile,
awesome, Laura.
before we leave, can we just put the slides really so that we can show that we've added resources to the end really quickly? Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Here you go. So you can, and I was just going to say that we have the slides here, that we didn't go all the way through them, but I'm going to, this webinar was recorded, and we will share all of the slides here. We have a lot of slides for students and elementary level, middle and high school. So we'll share all of that with you who attended over the next 24 hours.
And just be aware, it's not a comprehensive list, and some of the resources are in fact links to larger lists that have already been compiling some of these same things. So there's one for how white people can be anti-racist. It has actually a much longer reading list. It has a long podcast list. It has a long article reference list. So can you skip forward actually to the next? Yeah. And, you know, any of the books as adults on this, any of the books that are here are ones that are perfectly appropriate for you to read as well. And most of them are linked, but they're linked to Goodreads. I didn't actually want to link to a book. I didn't want to link to Amazon, but they do have descriptions of them. So there are those lists here.
Great. Okay, I want to wrap it up and be conscious of everyone's time. I want to thank you all for your sharing, being open-minded and sharing your thoughts on this subject. It's really a deep and profound subject that matters a lot to all of us at EB. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everybody who contributed via chat or by submitting questions or asking questions. We want to continue the conversation. You know, this is just the beginning. So we'll keep talking about this subject, which is very important. And like I said, we'll share the webinar, the recording of the webinar and all the slides very soon. And thank you again, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.